You are tuned into Blue Please here on WOW Radio with myself, Total Biscuit, and we have a very special guest in the virtual studio today. He goes by the name of Pixel Smith. He has been on a big trip around Europe, and he is here to talk about it. So, Mr. Pixel Smith, welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks very much.
Excellent. That finally seems to be working. Excellent. Thank God. The setup we have here is jury-rigged in the extreme.
Skype was messing up.
Yes,
I've just been added someone called Monica from Lithuania.
Really?
I don't know if that's good on Skype. I can't tell if she wants to steal my identity or get married.
Oh, well, flip a coin, see how it goes. Now, tell us a little bit about this trip, because you posted it originally on the EU forums to tell people about it and to specifically show people the documentation of the trip that you've been doing. You've actually been keeping track of it. So what made you want to do that in the first place?
Well, I started playing WoW in 2006, and for a couple of years I was guild master about sort of four or 5 months in, and after we got Vent about 6 months into that, we started pondering the idea of having a meetup. Maybe about a year and a half after I first started playing, we all a load of us met up in England, and then we had another one a bit later on. But because we had members from all over Europe, sometime late in December 2007 it would have been, me and another guildie, we were up having a chat, drunk, and we pondered visiting every single one of the people from the guild who hadn't been able to make it to either of those parties. That proved to be a mental idea, so we whittled it down eventually to about five different countries, and ultimately at the last minute organised a 19-day trip round. We ended up going to Finland, Sweden, Serbia, Bulgaria, and then Italy before heading home.
Indeed, excellent. So, I hear that your actual real job in the real world is part of a newspaper?
Yeah, that's right. I'm the news editor of a regional paper, which is like I don't really write much anymore. I just sort of organise things, tell reporters to write stuff.
Interesting. Now, did you ever consider perhaps including your adventures at some point in some kind of media? Do you think the media would actually really take well to that? Or is there perhaps a little bit of... Ever? Really? You think there's a bit of hostility?
Hey, it's so niche. That's the problem. It is WoW. I mean, newspapers are they're largely bought by older people. Obviously, there's a lot of young people who buy them as well. But generally, you start buying them when you've got kids, and you have to start taking life a bit more seriously. Otherwise, your kids are going to. So it's a fairly old audience, and they still. I mean, your basic Daily Mail reader still thinks that they think Pac-Man is the same as Grand Theft Auto 4. It's just the sort of noisy thing which teaches their grandchildren how to murder people and stop exercising, so they don't really want to read about it or accept it particularly. So no, definitely not in the paper. Coming out as a geek would be a tricky thing.
Indeed. And what kind of thing do you think you've initially learned, perhaps? Because you've been to so many places, you must have perhaps picked up some of the interesting cultural nuances. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
That's a tricky one, really, cultural nuances, because I think the thing that struck me, I went on sort of French and German exchanges when I was a school kid, and partly because they're in countries where they spoke totally different languages. It felt like a completely different world, also because I was young. This time it felt a lot more homogenised. I mean, Finland was kind of a bit sort of bleak, and well, it was nice, but quite sparse, full of trees and sort of and dusty. But the people there were sort of pretty similar to here. Sweden reminded me a lot of England, only a better version, with where the people are kind of more attractive. Serbia was a sort of an unknown quantity, because I mean I hadn't paid enough attention to the news back when I was 19, as when the UN bombed Belgrade, so all I knew before we went there was sort of I chatted to people in WoW who were pretty cool, but I just knew it had been sort of recently at war, so I didn't quite know what to expect. But it was pretty similar, really. Just had a bit of a Russian kind of air to the place, but you see the same advertising hoardings and a lot of the same cultural stuff, and same sort of applied to Bulgaria and Italy, partly because we were staying with nerds, and partly because they were all speaking English as well. The cultural differences were not as pronounced as I'd have expected.
Indeed. Now, meeting people online is always a little bit odd, because you're always a little bit worried, perhaps, whether or not the person you're going to meet in real life is the same, or indeed someone entirely different, perhaps a wielding axe murderer. It's entirely feasible. So, did you meet anyone on your trip that was significantly different personality-wise than they were online?
That's the odd thing. No, not really. The main one of the guys we met in Serbia, he's a pretty vicious warrior in game, and we met him, and he was massive. He was more friendly than your typical green axe wielding thing. But no, they were quite sort of similar to what we expected. I think we got over that when we first started using Vent and all met up. There's like an adjustment period of about a day and a half where you have to get used to the fact that this voice you're familiar with is coming out of an actual human face. It's slightly odd, but no. Oddly enough, there weren't that many people who were profoundly different to the way we sort of expected.
Indeed. Now, do you think perhaps that the advent of voice over IP and massively multiplayer online role-playing games is perhaps trying to kickstart some kind of social revolution in a way? It's an entirely different way to communicate, far more real-time over long distance than we've ever seen before, and with a lot more people over long distance than we've ever seen before. Do you think this kind of thing could have really happened before WoW? And what is it about WoW that's made that happen?
Well, it's a tough question. I suppose there's always been sort of long-distance communication like that. I guess people would have got to know each other over the telephone when the telephone first started sort of being around. And you've always had pen pals and stuff. Yeah. So it's just a different means of communication. I think the fact that you can, the fact that you're hanging around with people who all have the same main interest, it eases the sort of transition when you're going over and meeting them in real life, because you can talk about WoW for a day, and then you can spend the rest of the time sort of having them show you around their town and their country. I don't know if it's definitely a different way of communicating, but I think it's more internet based rather than just sort of WoW and other MMOs and stuff. They're an aspect of it, I suppose.
Yeah. What do you think that it is that people identify this kind of behaviour as odd? Because you were saying before the show that one of the reasons you didn't want to reveal which paper you worked for is because it would take you to the next level of geekdom in your particular social circle, and you were perhaps trying to avoid that. And you were probably joking a little bit there, but I imagine there was an element of truth to it. So why do you think people view this kind of thing so oddly? Is it really that different?
Well, it's not really, but the thing is, video games themselves and sort of knowing about the internet has always been pretty geeky, and all of a sudden, because everyone started using it, it stopped being geeky, and it's been useful for you to have been someone who is geeky throughout your life, because you're like the guy that people come to when their mouse stops working in the office. But by the same token, it's sort of it's fine to admit that you like video games. In a way, it maybe wouldn't have been sort of 10 years ago, because people who were well into them when they were kids are now sort of older, so there's more of them kicking around. Plus the Nintendo DS and the Wii, like loads of kids and grannies are sort of into that kind of stuff. Yeah. WoW's like a step down. It's sort of playing WoW is derided by other people who play video games. It's sort of it's one move on from tabletop role-playing games. So it's got a real perception of being properly nerdy.
Yeah. Do you think that it's just WoW that's got that kind of thing? Because you're saying perhaps that other gaming communities look down on WoW. Is it specifically WoW, or is it just MMOs in general? And why do you think that is?
I think it's WoW because it's the poster boy for MMOs, and it's got maybe just because it's the biggest sort of one, so it gets the lion's share of the attention. I mean, if you told, I played EVE for quite a while, nowhere near as long as I played WoW, and I still think that's interesting and sort of fascinating. But people would see that as more of a curiosity because they haven't heard about it. But everyone has heard about WoW, so I think it's the one that they associate with that kind of stuff. Quite why other communities I've heard you say on the show before, if you play EVE, they slag off people who play WoW, something rotten.
Frequently.
Yeah, and a lot of that's probably justified. But I don't know specifically what it is about WoW. What do you think it is specifically about WoW that makes it so derided?
Well, I think the fact that it is so accessible and so many people do play it has brought in a class of player that perhaps is less than optimal. Let's just generously say.
That's very difficult, isn't it?
Yeah, that's certainly within the gaming community. I don't think the community outside of WoW knows that. outside of the gaming community in general. I think they just see it as orcs, elves, and goblins, and it's the same thing that they saw 20, 30 years ago when their kids brought home a copy of Dungeons & Dragons and the Daily Mail readers assumed that it was an attempt to summon some kind of satanic daemon or something along those lines. And they still see it that way. I don't think that's really advanced in any respect, and I can't for the life of me figure out why, considering how much this game gets advertised all the time. You'd think perhaps that it's crossed over to the mainstream, but in reality you meet people in real life, and you even sometimes if you mention that you play WoW, it's like you've just put a massive great target sign on your head for mockery of everyone within 500 feet.
Yeah, that's definitely true. I think the orcs thing, the sort of orcs and wizards and stuff like that, that's definitely got that's like a big old barrier. It probably would have had it would be similarly derided if it was based in real life, and you sort of log on and then you have little mini games where you brush your teeth and eat your breakfast and then drive to work. Or that would be rubbish. Yeah, actually, and The Sims is really popular, so maybe that's what's gone wrong.
Yeah, the fact that the subject matter is a little bit weird. It's odd, though, because, I mean, you'd think, particularly with the success of, say, Lord of the Rings, the Lord of the Rings film trilogy, which was way more successful than I think anyone could have really predicted, and the kind of people that went to see it. I recall actually going to see the first movie, and it was at one of my local cinemas in Newcastle. It must have been a long time ago now, and when we left, the first thing that I heard some random chav say is like, "Oh, it was rubbish. I thought I was going to see him throw the ring in the fire." And I kid you not even realising that it was a trilogy or anything.
Yeah, thing is, I mean, Lord of the Rings, people are going to watch Lord of the Rings because it's big. It's like the big movie that's kicking around. And movies are perfectly acceptable. I mean, they weren't back when they came out. People would slag them off because they like books, and they thought that going and watching a film was the equivalent of putting your mind to sleep for a little while. So they'll go and watch that. But even if you're watching all three, Lord of the Rings is like a 10-hour commitment, and Warcraft is a hell of a lot more. And it's got like an associated culture. You don't have to buy into anything if you go and watch Lord of the Rings. You just you go there, and most people aren't going to stick around and maybe get posters on the wall. They might sort of buy like an ice cream, but that's as far as it goes. But I think WoW, because it actually involves other people, there's a social underbelly to it that makes other people think if there's a big group of people doing that, it's too hard to kind of penetrate. So I don't know if demonise it is the right word, but it's something along those lines.
Yeah, it seems rather odd, really. It's a very odd way of approaching it, particularly with WoW being such a casual, friendly game, so very easy for anyone to really get into, and yet it does seem to still have this barrier. This barrier existed with MMOs since perhaps the first MMOs came out, particularly with MUDs and stuff like that. They were viewed as impenetrable, very difficult to get into. EVE Online is still rightly viewed as impenetrable and difficult to get into.
You were right about the learning curve. It's pretty much worthless.
Yeah. It literally is. There's a great image online of the line graphs of difficulty learning curves and various popular MMOs, and the EVE Online one is a cliff face with various people hanging from nooses and bodies secured on pikes and all that kind of thing. I suppose that perhaps the general public might view it in that respect, but then again, they must also realise that there's a lot of people playing it, and I think perhaps they buy into the stereotype that all of these people are male, either kids or 20-somethings in their basement. When I recall going to the Wrath of the Lich King launch, the launch happened at the local Asda, of all places, because it was the only place in town where you could buy it. And the number of different people that were in line was ridiculous. All races, all genders, all ages, all walks of life. A couple of chavs in line, that you wouldn't expect to be WoW players were WoW players, and it's just odd that I suppose people haven't bought into that yet, and they haven't realised.
Yeah, well, that's probably the case. I mean, I went with a bloke called Brodos, he's also from the guild, and the people we stayed with were a fairly broad demographic mix. Like the first bloke we stayed with sort of lived with his parents, but I mean he was 19 or 20, so that was to be expected. And then in Sweden we stayed with a couple who were one was a student, one was a graduate. Then we went and stayed with a girl who's just recently graduated. And the people we stayed with in Serbia were like mid 20s, big sort of group of like 9 or 10 blokes. house. They were welcome. And then, Bulgaria and Italy, they were normal, socially adjusted people who just happened to have fired up WoW sometime because one of their mates got them introduced to it. And then, because it's a bit like crack, it just sort of takes hold, and then 2 years later they find themselves actually hosting a visit from someone. So it's there's a ridiculously broad number of people who play it, but because it's full of orcs and stuff, and because it's about 40% of the population are morons, it's got a bit of
40 is being a bit generous there, don't you think?
Yeah, that's true, but I'm hoping some people who listen will go and visit my website, so I don't want to be too abusive.
Indeed. Well, since we're actually rapidly running out of time, I want to thank you very much for coming on the show today. Been very informative, very enlightening. And would you like to briefly plug your website for the listeners?
Yeah, I'd love to briefly plug my website. You better interrupt me if we run out of time. It's called roll0.com, ROLL0, and it's got the Geek Adventure, as I've called it, which is the trip around Europe, and that's updated every week. It's got some other WoW stuff. If you want to have a gander at the kind of tone that it's about, go and have a look at the Elite Guide to Druids, which I posted in the WoW forums once, and that got a plug on the EU, WoW EU front page. And there's the world's nicest noob as well, which is me logging on as a level 1 alp called Barry the Bee, pretending to be an insect and having ridiculous conversations with people, and the chat logs are on it.
Indeed. Pixel Smith, thank you very much for coming on the show today. It's been a great pleasure.
No worries.
Excellent. We're going to pop into a music break, and we'll be right back with our next topic of the day, which is RNG. Random Loot is random. We shall see. Enjoy.